Once upon a time, there was a very beautiful doll's house. It belonged to two little girls named Lucinda and Jane. The house stood in the nursery near the window, where the afternoon sunlight would shine softly across the tiny furniture inside. It had red brick walls, white windows, little curtains, and a shiny front door with a brass knocker no bigger than a thimble. Inside the doll's house, there were tiny rooms, each one carefully arranged. There was a kitchen with a black stove and tiny dishes upon the shelves. There was a dining room with red chairs and a table set neatly for supper. And upstairs, there was a bedroom with little beds covered in soft blankets. Everything inside the house was perfectly tidy. The dolls, Lucinda and Jane, sat quietly in the dining room, as still as dolls always are. Outside the nursery window, evening sunlight stretched long and golden across the floorboards. And under the skirting board nearby lived two mice. Their names were Tom Thumb and Hunca Munca. Tom Thumb was very small and rather impatient. Hunca Munca was softer and calmer, though she was just as curious as Tom. For many days, they had watched the doll's house from their little hole in the wall. They had seen the tiny chairs, the shining spoons, the little cups, and the tiny fireplace. And every time they looked at it, they wondered what wonderful food might be inside. One quiet afternoon, when the nursery was empty and still, Tom Thumb crept slowly across the floor. Hunca Munca followed close behind him. Together, they climbed up onto the doll's house doorstep. Tom Thumb pushed against the little front door. To his surprise, it swung open. The mice stepped inside. They looked around in amazement. The room seemed grand and elegant to such tiny creatures. Tom Thumb stood in the dining room and stared at the table. "Oh!" he squeaked. "A feast!" Upon the table were little dishes holding ham and fish and pudding and pears. At least, that was what they appeared to be. Tom Thumb hurried to the table and bit into the ham. But instead of soft meat, his teeth struck something very hard. It was made of plaster. Tom Thumb looked offended. "This is extremely disappointing," he muttered. He bit the fish. It was plaster too. He tried the pears. They were just as hard. Tom Thumb grew more and more annoyed.
"All for show!"
he cried.
"Nothing real at all."
Hunca Munca peered quietly into the kitchen. She did not seem nearly as upset. Instead, she noticed the little pots and pans hanging neatly by the stove. There were tiny spoons, little plates, and small cups no larger than acorns. Hunca Munca thought they were lovely. Meanwhile, Tom Thumb continued stamping angrily around the dining room. In his frustration, he pushed one of the tiny chairs over backward. Crash! Then another chair tipped over. Then the little tablecloth slipped sideways. Hunca Munca hurried into the room. "Tom Thumb," she whispered, "you are making such a mess." But Tom Thumb was too cross to listen. He seized a tiny rolling pin and struck at the plaster pudding. The pudding broke apart with a sharp crack. Bits of plaster scattered across the table. Tom Thumb felt slightly better after that. Hunca Munca sighed softly. She preferred tidiness. While Tom Thumb wandered noisily through the doll's house, Hunca Munca quietly collected useful things. She found little feather pillows upstairs. She discovered tiny blankets folded neatly on the doll beds. In the kitchen, she found small spoons and cups that she thought would look very nice in their mouse hole. Carefully, she carried them downstairs one by one. Tom Thumb stomped into the bedroom and tugged at the bed covers. "These blankets are real," he announced proudly. At last, something in the house was soft and useful. He rolled himself up in one of the tiny blankets for a moment and declared it comfortable. Hunca Munca smiled. Together, the mice began carrying small treasures out of the doll's house. They carried little pillows, tiny dishes, a cradle, small food containers, even a little brass saucepan. Back and forth, they hurried across the nursery floor, disappearing through the hole in the skirting board and returning again. The nursery remained quiet around them. Dust floated gently through the golden evening light. The doll's house slowly became emptier and untidier. At last, the mice grew tired. Hunca Munca sat quietly beside the tiny fireplace and looked around the room. "It is a lovely house," she said softly. Tom Thumb grumbled. "It would be much better if the food were real." Then he noticed another plaster dish still sitting upon the table. With one last burst of annoyance, he knocked it onto the floor. Crash! The sound echoed through the nursery. The mice froze. Far away, down the hallway, they heard footsteps. Tom Thumb's whiskers twitched nervously. Hunca Munca quickly gathered the last little spoon she wished to keep. Then both mice hurried out of the doll's house and disappeared into the hole in the wall, just as the nursery door opened. A little while later, Lucinda and Jane came into the room. The sunlight had faded now, and the nursery glowed softly in the evening dimness. The little girls stopped suddenly when they saw the doll's house. "What has happened?" cried Lucinda. The chairs were overturned. The tablecloth was crooked. The plaster pudding was smashed into pieces, and many tiny things were missing altogether. Jane looked very serious. "I believe mice have been here," she whispered. Lucinda agreed. The two girls carefully tidied the doll's house. They straightened the chairs and swept away the bits of plaster pudding. But they could not find the missing spoons or blankets or little pillows anywhere. Meanwhile, inside the mouse hole beneath the floorboards, Hunca Munca was arranging the tiny treasures neatly. The feather pillows looked very comfortable inside the mouse nest. The little saucepan hung proudly near the wall, and the tiny cradle rested beside the bed of soft wool and feathers. Tom Thumb sat nearby, nibbling crumbs and looking rather pleased with himself. Days passed. The nursery became quiet again. The doll's house stood peacefully near the window as before. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the firelight flickered softly across the room, tiny scratching sounds could be heard beneath the floor. And every now and then, small things continued to disappear. A pin, a spoon, a bit of ribbon. Nobody ever saw the mice clearly again, but Lucinda and Jane often suspected that Tom Thumb and Hunca Munca were still visiting the doll's house when the nursery was asleep. And deep inside the mouse hole, beneath the warm wooden floorboards, Hunca Munca kept the little home beautifully tidy. Tom Thumb still complained about the plaster food from time to time, but secretly, he thought the doll's house was rather wonderful after all. And on quiet evenings, while the nursery rested in silence and moonlight silvered the window panes, the two mice curled up among their tiny, stolen pillows and slept very soundly. Good night, and sweet dreams.